Our next speaker, Dr. Glenn Johnson, is a professor and chair of the biology department at SUNY Potsdam. His current research focus and conservation efforts are concerning threatened species in the Adirondacks and in northern New York. In particular, our favorite race winner, Blanding's turtles.
Thank you for the introduction. And can you all hear me? Because I have a kind of a low voice. I want to find out about this race winner stuff, because that's not a good sounding thing. Oh yeah, I'm taller than most of the others. Can you hear me now? Okay, let me just get this organized. And John is right, it's definitely intimidating up here. So I'm going to talk about this one species, the Blanding's turtle, and some conservation efforts. And if you notice on that slide, I put someone else's name, Angelina Ross. She was a colleague who worked on this project almost from the beginning when she started as an undergraduate student at SUNY Potsdam to becoming a senior wildlife biologist with the DEC. Unfortunately, they shipped her down to Albany a couple of years ago, so we don't do that as much anymore. So a little bit about Blanding's turtles, and our population's fairly close to here. It's a fairly large turtle, and I'm just going to assume you don't know much about them. The key characteristic for them to identify them from other turtles is the bright yellow chin and the fact that they're pretty much always smiling when you look at their face. They are sometimes called semi-terrestrial or semi-aquatic because they do leave the water a lot, and they have somewhat of a dome to their shell, which we often see in terrestrial type turtles. And they have a little bit of a hinge on the plastron, the bottom side, so they can close up a little bit, and some of the local folks call them box turtles. I've heard that expression. So I went the wrong way. The underside looks like that. You can tell males from females. I'm not going to get into all those details, but if you'd like to know, I can tell you about that later. This is the general distribution for Blanding's turtles, and you can see in most every state and province they occur in, they're considered threatened or endangered. Pennsylvania doesn't list them, even though it turns out they have about 2 turtles total that they know of in the state, and they're right up in that corner. This map doesn't really show northern New York very well, but the next map should. This is from the New York State Amphibian and Reptile Atlas. You can see a lot of those yellow blocks up in the North Country, St. Lawrence and Jefferson County, where they're encountered. And this is a more smooth map that you can see in the New York State Amphibian and Reptile book. So they're centered around the Great Lakes states, and they're sort of outliers here in parts of New York. We have a population down in Dutchess County, a small one in Saratoga County that was fairly recently discovered, but also further east in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, a little bit into Maine, and one very isolated population in Nova Scotia, which is considered endangered up there. So that's their distribution. Their basic life history is sort of outlined here. You don't have to read it all. I can tell you the basic pattern is these turtles are a lot like the loons you heard about earlier. They take a long time to reach sexual maturity, much longer than loons. The females typically 18 to 20 years before they lay their first egg. But they do live a long time. The oldest known one in the wild was 83 years old about 5 years ago when Justin Congdon found one in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that he had marked in the 1950s. He's sort of the grand old man of Blanding's turtles. And he found it again 4 or 5 years ago and was able to determine its age. He knew how old it was in the 50s. That's pretty long. Their clutch size, the number of eggs they lay, is similar to a painted turtle, which is a much smaller turtle, and much less than a snapping turtle. Those are the other 2 turtles that tend to occupy the same wetlands. Snapping turtles might lay up to 50 eggs. So they have a low clutch size. What this translates to is it takes a long time for them to reproduce, for recruitment to happen, for them to replace themselves in the population. Males can become mature much earlier. They live in wetlands, but not all wetlands. They tend to prefer shrub-scrub swamps. You can see pictured here. The lower picture is a large wetland near Wilson Hill Wildlife Management Area. The upper picture is a road going through a and that road was built by taking material from the wetland and piling it in the center to build the road. It services about half a dozen people, and it kills a lot of Blanding's turtles. It's a road I wish that didn't exist. They also need basking sites. This species does not really get out into the main channel of the St. Lawrence, but occasionally they might. But they are present on Grindstone and Wellesley Island. Probably the closest population to here is Grindstone, but they're also in the French Creek Wildlife Management Area around here. So that's their general habitat. It's where they spend most of their time. It's where they overwinter. But they do have to go somewhere else to lay their eggs. And unlike painted turtles and snapping turtles, they tend not to nest on the sides of roads. They tend to go further. And historically, they went to places that had exposed sand. And there's lots of pockets of the old sand dunes that used to occur in this area from a long time ago. And they utilize those. Unfortunately, they also like to use agricultural landscapes, and we'll see a little bit later. That can function as a bit of an ecological trap for them. I don't have to talk about that. That was a place they nested in Nova Scotia where there's no sand, there's nothing. It's just scree like that. And they nested in that rock pile. This is a site in Lisbon, one of those ancient sand dunes that has not been fully covered by vegetation. And it's one of the best nesting sites that I know of in this region. And we've been focusing a lot of our effort there. They also use the spaces to go from the wetlands to those uplands, and they'll occasionally use vernal pools. The males and females will wander there to get food. There's lots of rich food sources in vernal pools that only exist for a short period of time. And we don't know much about the really young ones, where they go. No one's studied that extensively. So I moved to this region in 1998 and very quickly started a project the very next year looking at Blanding's turtles distribution across this North Country here, and engaged lots of undergraduate students out trapping for turtles all across this area. And here you can see a couple of places where they were trapping. We started doing some telemetry studies back in the early 2000s to get information about how they use time and space. And here's one typical sort of year movement pattern for a female that ended up nesting in that big cornfield right there. This area, by the way, is that's Route 37 up top, but that's a big cornfield. It was just across from Wilson Hill Wildlife Management Area. And the other area is Coles Creek. It is now completely owned by the state, this whole region, but it was private back then. So they make big movements. And they've been known to move as much as 2 kilometers from their wetland to nest and then back again, which is a very long movement for a turtle. This shows the places where we trapped over since 1999 to this slide was made about 2015 or 16. And all the dark spots are places where we encountered them, and the open circles is where we trapped but didn't encounter them. They may or may not be there, but most likely they're not there. We put a lot of effort in. Effort wasn't the same in all these sites, but it was similar. Now, this information was used by a graduate student of Tom Langen's at Clarkson University to develop a species distribution model. And what she did is took that data and used 75% of it, of this presence or absence data, and built a model at 2 scales, 250 meters around that point, that site, or 8 kilometers around that site, and 2 different models, which I'm not going to go through the details of because I don't understand them, and measured mostly from geographic information systems all the variables you see on the bottom, and was able to compare sites that had turtles and sites that didn't, and then used 25% of the data that was not used to build the model to validate it, to see how close they were. And it's hard to see here, but if you look at the max scent, the very lower part, those high numbers, 0.9, suggest that at both scales, 250 meters around the point, 8 kilometers around the point, the model she built was very good at predicting whether turtles would be there or not, and correctly classified those 25% that were that didn't have turtles with those that did. And elevation was probably the most important variable in both, so they don't get up into the Adirondacks. It's probably more a function of the wetland types that are there compared to in the St. Lawrence Valley. This is just a view across St. Lawrence County of what her model predicted as places where we would find these turtles, so there's still lots of places to explore, I guess. And she then took this across the entire Jefferson, St. Lawrence, the St. Lawrence Valley, and across the state. And it fairly closely mimicked where we find them across the state. Although the Hudson Valley, it shows them to be much more widespread there. Currently, there's just a pocket of them in Dutchess County, pretty much in the town of Poughkeepsie, and a small pocket in Saratoga, which genetically turned out the Saratoga population to be much closer to populations in New England, and the Dutchess County appeared to be closer to populations in the middle part of the U.S. So I'm not sure how to explain that. These are her conclusions from that. It's basically what I just said, so I'll go past that. So after all these years of tracking and trapping and thinking about these turtles, the big conservation issues for them are related to their life history and how they use time and space. First, there's a lot of conflicts between the way we use the landscape and the way the turtles do. We've converted, the wetlands are largely protected these days, at least from draining. They still receive contaminants and things like that. But the nesting habitat has changed, and much of it's been converted to agriculture, or agriculture looks appealing to turtles and they tend to nest there. And I'll show you in a bit that that's not a good thing to do. Another issue is roads. That's probably the biggest issue, and it's something we might be able to do something about. They can be obstacles to movement. A lot of them get killed crossing roads. Another issue is related to that is the loss of adult females. It turns out they're the key factor in the population. They're the key demographic, not just any female, but the old ones, because they breed up to the last minute of their lives. An 83-year-old Blanding's turtle can lay 12 eggs if she's successful to cross roads. And if you think about it, they're very faithful to the places where they nest, and they go the same route year after year. So if they have to cross a road, or in some cases multiple roads, they've got to do that at least twice every year for 60 years. The chances of them getting hit by a car actually increase because the traffic volume has increased somewhat in the North Country over the last 60 years. Another issue is there's much reduced recruitment because, and this is true for probably most turtles, 90% of the nests that are laid by turtles are either completely or partially destroyed by these mesocarnivores, these human-subsidized animals like raccoons and skunks. There's a lot more of those around than there used to be. And they key in on these places and eat every egg in the nest. They dig them up. We've had instances where we're out tracking turtles that are about to lay eggs, and we're watching raccoons just behind us, just following along. So I'll tell you what we do about that. We can't remove all the raccoons in the world, and we don't want to, but that's not a choice. So there's two sort of ecological or evolutionary traps these animals are falling into. The first is when they go to nest and where they select. So they're going to these places that look like the upper picture, open sand, exposed to the sun, loose substrate, they drain well. Really good place to nest. Early in the season, and these guys nest throughout June, but the peak is probably right in the middle of June, they are attracted to cornfields, row crops especially, because it looks good. And if the corn is up, it's very short, but very quickly it grows up and shades it out. And we actually have shown that there's reduced nest success in places in cornfields. The other thing is the road itself. Normally when they historically didn't have roads and then they keep going the same path and there's a road there, that's a trap for them. They don't change their behavior because there's a road there. They will willingly cross roads. Some animals don't. So with those threats out there, we developed a conservation plan for Blanding's turtles. In 1983, they were put on the threatened species list in New York. It was recognized back then that they were declining. In fact, almost every population that was studied showed virtually no recruitment, no young turtles. So they're all, and because they can live 80 years, it takes a long time before we can see the effect on the whole population. So a colleague of mine in Hofstra University calls them, he's a turtle biologist, zombie populations. They're the living dead. They're not producing any young, they're not replacing themselves. And we're potentially seeing that. We were getting virtually no juveniles, certainly no hatchlings, in any of our trapping efforts throughout the early 2000s, and even almost till today. So we developed that management plan. The other bit of data that we have a lot of is road crossings. So some of this is opportunistic, but some of it is targeted. We did surveys along roads, repeated them over time to see where crossings were, counting live and dead animals on the road, and developed a large data set of road crossings across Jefferson and St. Lawrence counties where we knew turtles occurred. So all kinds of people were giving us this data, and this data was fairly recently being used now to create some more models to be, can we predict where a turtle's going to cross the road? So two of Dr. Langen's students at Clarkson just finished their MS theses on this. The first one, there's three ways to use this data that might inform conservation. One is you can compare the landscape around those road crossings and see, you can then compare that to areas on the same roadway, what the landscape is there. Is there any differences? And one of Dr. Langen's students, Alex Burrows, showed that you could. There's enough information there because we had a lot of road crossings to make predictions about where they're going to cross when you look at the land cover data around that area. Second thing you can do is see if there are hotspots, areas where lots of them are killed. And another student of Dr. Langen's used this same set of data we collected, Sean Jackson, and did just that. And then he was able to do something called a least cost path analysis to see what pathway a turtle would take from the wetland to those points in the road. And the ones that would be the least cost, areas of open areas or woodland edges. And with that, you can predict where a turtle might cross. And if you know that, then there's perhaps something you can do about reducing mortality on roads, which is one of the things we can do something about. So that's really what I'm going to focus on for the rest of this. And if you think about it, what can you do to prevent a turtle or reduce turtles' mortality crossing roads? You can shout out something if you can think of something you can do. Anyone? Turtle tunnel. Yep. Anything else? Shovel in the car. Yeah, and hopefully you do that. You don't need a shovel with a Blandings turtle, and you don't need one for a snapping turtle. I can show you later how to pick up a snapping turtle. But turtle tunnels, any other brilliant ideas? Signage, yeah. And, okay, we'll just go with that. Well, one thing is you make a barrier. So you can prevent a turtle from crossing the road by building a fence. That could work. But I don't know who mentioned, I can't even really see any individual, who mentioned turtle tunnels, but you need to connect those to some kind of culvert or tunnel to get across the road. Otherwise, the turtles might go all the way around your fence. As I said, they're very faithful to where they nest. So we tested some methods of building fences in the middle 2000s to see how that worked. At one site where there was a lot of mortality of turtles, the Route 68 that goes from Canton to Ogdensburg, especially around Upper and Lower Lakes Wildlife Management Area, which I think Jess Pearson mentioned earlier. A lot of turtles are being hit there, not just Blandings, but all kinds of turtles. So there's fences there. You can see them there today. They have not been maintained, but it clearly led to a reduction in the amount of roadkill of wildlife in general, small wildlife like frogs and turtles. We learned from that and built what I think is a much better fence. This is County Route 39 in Louisville. Probably, I don't know who knows where that is, but that's a major area, a big Blandings turtle population. This fence was built by the New York Power Authority as mitigation for the work they were doing, replacing the overhead transmission lines from the power dam all the way down to Utica. And the DEC said, well, you have to do this to do that, because they were going through wetlands that had Blandings turtles. And it's been pretty effective. It was monitored for a couple of years. Here's a turtle walking along it. I monitored that road for road kills for many years, and there was quite a few. And very, very few after the fence went up. And we're looking at ways to keep that fence maintained and maybe enlarge it a little bit in that particular site. Culverts underneath, you can build. The fence that you saw in the previous picture, the road is pretty much at grade, so you really can't dig a tunnel under it. The culverts that existed are semi-adequate. You can make better ones. This is a site on Wellesley Island, by the way. So Wellesley Island has a significant population of Blandings turtles, And this is the road as you come into the park. And if you know that site, you drive in, past where you pay, and you loop around if you wanted to go to the nature center or the part of the campground. And there's a wetland around there. And surprisingly, the speed limit is really low there. But turtles were hit and killed multiple times on that road. So they needed to replace the culvert that went underneath that road. And Angie Ross, who I mentioned before, got involved and asked them to build a different kind of culvert that turned out to be very effective. And you can see there's two little, I don't know if there's any birders out there, but there's two Virginia rails running through there. We have tons of wildlife who've been using that particular culvert, including turtles. We never got a picture of a Blandings turtle though doing it. So barriers, eco passages, you can do those things. They're expensive. It's really hard to build a new culvert or a fence along a road without a lot of money. We did test different kinds of signs. A lot of difficulties there because New York State Department of Transportation follows the federal guidelines. So they would not allow us to use a sign with an image on it because it had not been approved by the Federal Highway Administration. Deer, cow, horse, moose, salamander are all approved, but turtles were not. So they wouldn't let us do that. So we limited to county roads who technically should be following the same guidelines, but they let us put up signs with turtles on them. I think those are more effective than the one that just says turtle crossing. However, it turns out neither of them are really all that effective. So we eventually put hinges on them so we could fold them and leave the signs up all through the year. We'd only open them for the month of essentially June when their females are out nesting movements. Otherwise you get, you drive past the deer sign to get home every day. Do you see it anymore? Over time, it just becomes the background. So it's more novel when you open them up. We then tested a bunch of sites, and we looked at the driving speed at these sites with and without signs, before the sign went in, the year before, a mile before where the sign was, and places without signs, and found virtually no difference. People don't slow down for a turtle sign. And I didn't really expect them to. But it might raise their awareness a little bit when you're driving. When we looked at road kills of turtles, there's a lot of data there, but the upshot is we didn't see much difference there either. There's a couple of places where there was a tantalizing difference. We tested this for 2 years in places that never had a sign, places that had a sign added in the second year, and did not find much of a difference in roadkill, but the numbers are very low, so it's hard to make any inferences to that. So I still think signs have some value, but not as much as you might think. That leaves something nobody mentioned, and that is turtles are crossing the road to get to the other side to nest. And if we can make those sites that look attractive to them on the same side of the road as their wetland, they don't have to cross the road. So we're doing that now, and that's how I'll sort of end this thing. We're creating nest sites. The first one we did, and this was done by the New York Power Authority, and this was on that cornfield I showed earlier. But next to it was an open site, sort of open, and we were able to go in there, the Power Authority did, and create a big open habitat that could potentially be maintained. Turtles were sort of going through this all the time, but not nesting here. They were mostly going into that cornfield. Since this was created, you've seen some significant nesting there. Now, that site is now part of the Wilson Hill Wildlife Management Area, and it's managed by the DC. Matter of fact, Mike Morgan, who I saw earlier here, is in charge of managing that site. And we've been tracking together turtle use of that site for many years, and it's substantial, so they're using it. So we know we can create places that are attractive to them. One of the things we did was we put in some berms to pure sand. The rest of it was just kind of scraped and left open. We also put temperature monitors in the soil, and the important graph is the lower one. What that shows is, the bottom line of that graph is the average daily temperature in the cornfield. The jagged line above it is the difference in temperature in the treated area that we cleared. So it's significantly higher. That's in degrees centigrade. That is up to 7 degrees warmer in that soil. Now, the warmer the soil, the faster turtles develop, and more members of the clutch are successful. We also looked at nest success in the cleared area, the treated area, compared to that cornfield and to a natural site, and saw that the natural site and the cleared area were similar. If you look at the percent that hatched on the end, pretty similar, whereas those turtles that nested in the cornfield had a much reduced nest success, number of eggs that hatch out of that clutch. Again, small sample size, but repeated it a few more years and held true. This is that swamp I mentioned in Lisbon, and if you zoom in, you'll see there's little pockets of open sand. This is where we're focusing a lot of our effort. This turns out to be probably the largest population of Blanding's turtles in the state, larger than any of the ones in the other parts of the state. Failed to mention there's a tiny pocket of them in the Seneca Indian Reservation in Erie County in western New York that still remains. Most of the western New York ones that we knew of in the past seem to be extirpated. So here, what we've been doing since those early days is had teams of students going out in June every evening. These turtles tend to nest from 5 p.m. to 1 p.m., 1 a.m., and follow turtles. We had tags on them. We could follow them till they nested. And once they did cross this open sand, we then could put these nest protectors, these predator guards on top of the nest. And it would keep out, hopefully, the raccoons and some of the other predators. Here's some skunk and raccoons coming up to those nest protectors. They know what's in there, they just can't get in. And the bobcat up top was so angry he urinated on it in that picture. And bobcats tend not to dig up nests for turtle eggs, but if they stiffed them out, they probably would. Raccoons and skunks are the big predators. So we knew we can't do this forever. You can't have teams of students out to the site forever. So we looked at some other ways of keeping those animals out short of slaughtering them all. So we put in an electric fence, and we knew about a guy who did this on the Mississippi, right on the banks for a map turtle that lived down there. He was able to successfully keep the raccoons out. So we built this electric fence around the entire area and monitored it. You can see the fence actually has a layer of chicken wire below it. It's only a short height. And the chicken wire serves as a ground and a way to prevent a raccoon or a skunk from digging under the nest, because they're pretty, skunk's kind of smart, but the raccoon's very smart. And then we put cameras. We still protected the nest so we could see what happens. We put cameras on them. Here's turtles that successfully went under the nest. We never electrocuted a turtle, although I'm pretty sure we shocked a big snapper once. But the animals, the carnivores were staying out. I've got some great pictures of a black bear being zapped, and the next picture you just see its rear end just gone. So it's effective. But you do have to maintain it. You have to come back and make sure it works every year. So a bigger project, the most recent one, I'll just kind of leave you with this one, is, and I can't tell how I am for time, but hopefully I'll do it. What's that? 3 minutes. 3 minutes, oh boy. So this one here, what we did was apply for some money to make a bigger splash, to do more of this. We used money from the Natural Resource Damage Assessment and Restoration Fund. We were able to get some of that. And we decided we were going to go larger. So we selected some other sites, and in those sites we created large nest sites, half acre, even larger in some cases. And we started tracking turtles with GPS tags. We couldn't afford single tags, so we had to put a VHF tag to find the turtle and a GPS tag to see where it went. We could track them and see their paths, and that's where we could build these places. I bought that tractor to create this site. Interestingly, I sold it right after the project for the exact same price, so I got a free tractor for 3 years. Cleared all the trees, landowner allowed us to do this, and cleared it out completely, grubbed it. I left that pine in there, brought in sand, and this site, 110 truckloads of sand, 20 tons in a truck, there's a lot of sand. Spread it out, and it looks like this. Here's the site before, from a drone view before we did it, and after. Put in the electric fence. You still protect the nest just because I don't trust the fences quite yet. Compared the temperature, we had reference sites, we had ones we created, they track each other well. Put cameras on the nest to look at them. This is an interesting site. This turtle was hit by a car. She was still alive. We took her to, some of you may know Dr. Brayton Hill here in Watertown. He used to work on this project when he was an undergrad. He x-rayed it and induced it with oxytocin. We got all the eggs out. We put them in one of these new sites. And that picture is one of those turtles that The mom died after a few more days, but this one was able to survive with our intervention. It's probably its first look at the world. So I'm just about done. I want to leave time for at least a question. They seem to work. That's what these tables show. And the next step is to manage the vegetation because stuff's going to regrow. And how do we do that? What's the best way? This is what it looks like there for a couple of years. And we're put in for a funding to look at ways to control vegetation in these plots, from mechanically to, we don't really want to use a lot of herbicide. Thinking of using things like goats to go put them in there and let them eat all the vegetation every now and then. And that's it. A lot of people to thank, people who worked on this over the years. Also thank the turtles. So I'll leave it there. I'll be here till the end of this thing, so if you have questions and if there's no time for any. Okay.
Will you be around after this as well?
For a bit, yeah.
We have land use turtles on our farm in Wall Street.
I know where your farm is, yeah. I've stopped there. Angie Ross has been to your farm, yeah. Yeah, I know you have them, excellent.
Don?
Yeah, a few years ago, British Petroleum was in our area.
Wind farm?
Well, I don't know the farm.
I know it, that's what they say. I worked on that.
Okay, that was my question. You were the guy, right?
Well, I don't know if I was the guy, but I was a guy. Yeah, yeah. I was involved in that with through River Edge, Lee Harper. You guys know Lee. Yeah. Collaborated with him a lot on this. All right. See you.